The aluminum baseball bat connected with her ribs with a sickening crack that echoed through the empty parking garage. Sarah Chen didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just absorbed the impact and waited for what her attackers couldn't possibly understand was about to happen. The second bat struck her shoulder blade, and somewhere in the darkness behind the concrete pillars, electronic systems that had been dormant for 3 years suddenly hummed to life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Rivera swung again, this time aiming for her knees. The Louisville slugger caught her just above the kneecap, and she crumpled forward onto the oil-stained concrete. Behind them, Danny Walsh and Trevor Knox laughed with the ugly satisfaction of bullies who thought they'd finally cornered someone who couldn't fight back. They had no idea that each strike was being registered, cataloged, and responded to by defense protocols they'd never heard of. Want to know why these 3 gang members went from laughing to running for their lives in the span of 90 seconds? Why did the woman they thought was helpless turn their own violence into the very thing that destroyed them? The story begins 6 hours earlier, when Sarah Chen pulled her battered Honda Civic into the employee parking lot of Meridian Tech Solutions at exactly 5:47 a.m. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the industrial district skyline, and the lot was empty except for a few overnight security vehicles and the occasional maintenance truck. Sarah preferred it this way, arriving before the crowds, when she could move through the building without drawing attention to herself. At 28, Sarah had mastered the art of invisibility, average height, unremarkable build, dark hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the same rotation of plain button-down shirts and dark slacks, carried a generic black laptop bag, and spoke only when spoken to. To her coworkers at the mid-level technology firm, she was exactly what her employment records claimed, a quiet database administrator who'd graduated from a community college in Oregon and worked her way up through a series of unremarkable IT positions. Her badge photo showed a forgettable face with tired eyes and the hint of a smile that never quite reached full brightness. Sarah Chen, Employee Idaho 4471, Level 2 Security Clearance, Database Administration Department. Clean background check, no criminal record, no red flags. The kind of employee who processed payroll data and inventory reports without complaint, attended mandatory training sessions without questions, and went home to a studio apartment where she lived alone with a cat named Pixel. But employment records, like many official documents, sometimes tell carefully constructed lies. The Meridian building was a converted warehouse in the industrial sector of Portland, Oregon, surrounded by auto repair shops, freight companies, and the kind of businesses that operated with more cash than paperwork. Meridian Tech Solutions occupied the entire structure, handling data management for a diverse client base that included everything from regional healthcare networks to logistics companies moving freight through the Pacific Northwest. Sarah's workstation was tucked into a corner of the 3rd floor, behind a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets that provided natural camouflage. Her desk was meticulously organized, 2 monitors displaying streams of database queries, a mechanical keyboard that she'd brought from home, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived under fluorescent lighting. No personal photos, no decorative items, nothing that would give away details about her life outside these walls. She'd been working at Meridian for 14 months, and in that time, she'd established a routine that kept her interactions with others to a minimum. Arrive early, eat lunch at her desk while reading technical manuals, and stay late to avoid the evening rush. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, considered her a model employee, reliable, competent, and refreshingly drama-free in an office that seemed to attract personality conflicts like a magnet. What Janet didn't know was that Sarah's database administration duties were a carefully maintained cover for activities that would have triggered federal investigations if anyone had bothered to look closely. While her screens displayed routine queries and data maintenance tasks, hidden processes ran in the background, monitoring networks and communications that officially didn't exist. Sarah Chen was a ghost in the system, and she'd been hunting other ghosts for longer than anyone at Meridian Tech Solutions had been employed there. The real Sarah Chen had died in a car accident in Beaverton 3 years ago. No family, few friends, unremarkable enough that her death barely registered in local obituaries. But her identity had been carefully preserved and enhanced by people who understood the value of clean documentation and unquestioned backgrounds. The woman who carried her name now had borrowed more than just a social security number and credit history. She'd inherited an entire life constructed with the kind of attention to detail that only government agencies with unlimited budgets could provide. Bank records showing steady employment, rental history demonstrating financial responsibility, medical records indicating routine checkups, and no significant health issues. A complete digital footprint that would satisfy any background check while revealing absolutely nothing about the person who actually lived behind it. The truth was more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Sarah had spent the previous morning tracking financial transfers through a network of shell companies that existed only as digital entries in databases scattered across 14 countries. The money moved in carefully disguised increments, never large enough to trigger automated monitoring systems, but following patterns that told a story about weapons purchases and operational funding for groups that official government policy claimed didn't exist. Her real employer wasn't Meridian Tech Solutions, her actual job title wasn't database administrator. And the quiet woman who processed inventory reports and answered help desk tickets was, in reality, one of the most effective intelligence operatives currently working in the Pacific Northwest. But effective operatives made enemies, and sometimes those enemies discovered things they weren't supposed to know. Marcus Rivera had been watching her for 3 weeks, not because he suspected her of being anything other than what she appeared to be, but because he'd identified her as a target for reasons that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with simple criminal opportunity. Marcus ran a crew that specialized in what they called soft robberies, targeting people who looked vulnerable, worked regular schedules, and were unlikely to put up significant resistance. Sarah Chen, with her solitary routine and obvious lack of security awareness, had seemed like perfect prey. She left work at the same time every evening, walked to her car alone, and drove the same route home through neighborhoods that offered plenty of secluded spots for an enterprising criminal to stage an ambush. Marcus had done this kind of operation dozens of times. Find someone isolated, threaten them with overwhelming force, take their valuables, and disappear before anyone notices they are missing. Danny Walsh and Trevor Knox were Marcus's usual partners for these operations. Danny was 19, thin as a rail, with nervous energy that made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. He'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes that taught him to trust no one and fight for everything. Trevor was older, built like a linebacker, with the kind of casual brutality that came from years of using violence to solve problems that required more thoughtful solutions. Together, they'd perfected a system. Marcus would do the talking, Danny would handle crowd control and watch for witnesses, and Trevor would provide the physical intimidation that made most victims comply without resistance. They'd never encountered anyone who fought back effectively, and they'd certainly never targeted someone whose response to violence would be anything other than fear and submission. Their plan was simple. Wait for Sarah to finish her evening shift, follow her to the parking garage, and corner her before she could reach her car. The underground garage at Meridian was perfect for their purposes. Minimal lighting, no security cameras in the employees section, and multiple exit routes if anything went wrong. They'd demand her purse, her laptop, and whatever cash she might be carrying. Standard operating procedure for what should have been a routine mugging. But Marcus Rivera had made the same mistake that hundreds of criminals before him had made when targeting people they didn't really understand. He'd assumed that quiet meant weak, that isolated meant vulnerable, and that someone who avoided confrontation was someone who couldn't handle violence when he found them. Sarah finished her shift at 6:15 p.m., just as she had every weekday for the past 14 months. She saved her work, logged out of her systems, and gathered her belongings with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Her laptop bag contained her personal computer, a few technical manuals, and what appeared to be a standard collection of work-related materials. What it actually contained was considerably more interesting, though the casual observer would never notice the subtle modifications that had been made to seemingly ordinary items. The laptop itself had been enhanced with processing capabilities that exceeded most government installations. The technical manuals contained information that wasn't available to civilian contractors. And hidden within the innocent collection of pens, cables, and office supplies were tools that had been designed for purposes that had nothing to do with database administration. She took the elevator to the parking level, her footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell as she made her way toward her car. The Honda Civic was parked in her usual spot, near the back corner, where the overhead lighting was dim and the security presence was minimal. Sarah had chosen this location deliberately, not because she was careless about her safety, but because she understood that sometimes the best way to avoid attention was to appear vulnerable while maintaining tactical advantages that weren't immediately obvious. Marcus, Danny, and Trevor were waiting behind a concrete support pillar 20 feet from her car. They'd been there for 40 minutes, discussing their approach and psyching themselves up for what they expected to be a quick and profitable encounter. Marcus carried a baseball bat, Danny had a tire iron, and Trevor preferred a length of steel pipe that he'd wrapped with electrical tape to improve his grip. They were armed, outnumbered their target 3-1, and had the advantage of surprise and superior positioning. By every conventional measure, they had overwhelming tactical superiority. But conventional measures didn't account for the fact that the woman they were about to attack had been trained by people who understood violence on a level that street criminals couldn't comprehend. Sarah heard them before she saw them, not their voices or their footsteps, but the subtle change in air circulation that indicated additional bodies in an enclosed space. She'd been trained to notice details that most people missed, to read environments for signs of danger that existed below the threshold of conscious awareness. The parking garage felt different than it had yesterday, and that difference told her everything she needed to know about what was about to happen. She continued walking toward her car, maintaining the same pace and posture she'd used every evening for more than a year. To Marcus and his crew, she appeared completely unaware of their presence, focused on her phone and oblivious to the danger that was about to materialize around her. They had no way of knowing that she'd already identified their positions, cataloged their weapons, and begun running through response scenarios that would neutralize the threat while maintaining her cover identity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus stepped out from behind the pillar when she was 10 feet from her car. "Hey there, sweetheart. I need to have a little conversation with you." Sarah looked up from her phone, her expression showing exactly the right amount of surprise and concern. Not too much fear, which might provoke them to violence prematurely, but enough anxiety to make them feel confident in their control of the situation. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Danny and Trevor emerged from their concealment, spreading out to cut off her potential escape routes. The formation was professional enough to suggest they'd done this before, but sloppy enough to reveal gaps in their tactical thinking that Sarah had already identified and cataloged. "You don't need to know us," Trevor said, rolling his shoulders to emphasize his size advantage. "You just need to cooperate, and nobody gets hurt." Marcus smiled with the confident cruelty of someone who'd never encountered effective resistance. "Purse, laptop bag, car keys, and whatever cash you've got on you. Make this easy, and we'll be out of your life in 2 minutes." Sarah clutched her laptop bag tighter against her chest, a gesture that Marcus interpreted as fear, but which actually served to activate systems that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of scenario. Hidden sensors registered her elevated heart rate, the change in her breathing pattern, and the specific sequence of movements she'd used to grip the bag's handle. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking garage's immediate area, receivers picked up the signals and began executing protocols that had been programmed by people who understood that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, and that sometimes good offense required tools that existed beyond the normal boundaries of civilian self-defense. "Please," Sarah said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of frightened cooperation. "I don't want any trouble. I'll give you whatever you want." But even as she spoke, she was calculating distances, evaluating angles, and preparing for the moment when her carefully maintained cover would be blown apart by the very violence these men thought would ensure their success. Marcus stepped closer, his bat held casually but ready to be used. "Smart girl, let's start with the bag." By age 12, she was writing code that could penetrate security systems designed by teams of professional developers. But genius without direction often led to trouble, and Sarah's high school years had been marked by increasingly sophisticated attempts to access networks that were supposed to be impenetrable. She'd never stolen anything or caused damage, but her digital footprints had attracted attention from people who monitored such activities professionally. Dr. Harper's offer had been elegant in its simplicity. Come work for people who could provide challenges worthy of her capabilities, in exchange for using those capabilities to protect national interests. The alternative, though never explicitly stated, was having her more questionable extracurricular activities become the subject of federal investigation. Sarah had accepted the recruitment offer without knowing that she was joining an organization that officially didn't exist, funded through budget line items that appeared in no public documents, and tasked with operations that would never be acknowledged by any government spokesperson. The Quantum Applications Research Division, or QARD, operated out of a facility in Langley that looked like a typical technology incubator but contained computing resources that exceeded most university research centers combined. Sarah's initial assignment had been developing encryption protocols for communications between deep cover operatives and their handlers, working on problems that required both theoretical mathematics and practical understanding of how technology performed in hostile environments. She'd excelled at the technical aspects immediately, breaking codes, building unbreakable ciphers, and creating communication systems that could function reliably while remaining invisible to surveillance networks designed by foreign intelligence services. But QARD's mission extended beyond pure cryptography, and Sarah's role had evolved as her supervisors recognized capabilities that went beyond mathematical genius. The training had begun gradually, self-defense classes that were supposedly voluntary but actually mandatory, situational awareness exercises disguised as team-building activities, weapons familiarization sessions that were framed as recreational shooting but actually served to evaluate her psychological profile under stress. Within 18 months, Sarah was no longer just a cryptographer. She'd become a field operative specializing in technical penetration of target networks, with the skills necessary to survive in environments where discovery meant capture, interrogation, and probable execution by hostile intelligence services. Her first operational assignment had taken her to Kazakhstan, where she'd spent 3 months working as a systems administrator for an oil exploration company, while actually monitoring communications between regional terrorist organizations and their international financial supporters. The cover identity had been perfect. Young, technically skilled American contractor earning money to pay off student loans, culturally naive enough to be dismissed by local security services as harmless. The mission had been successful beyond expectations. Sarah had identified funding streams that led to the disruption of planned attacks in 7 different countries, while simultaneously gathering intelligence that prevented the theft of weapons-grade uranium from a supposedly secure facility outside Almaty. But success in the intelligence world often led to increasingly dangerous assignments, and Sarah's next deployment had taken her to Syria during the height of the civil war, operating undercover as a humanitarian aid coordinator, while actually penetrating the communication networks of various armed factions to locate and eliminate high-value targets. That mission had gone wrong in ways that still appeared in her dreams 3 years later. The explosion that destroyed the refugee camp in Aleppo had been intended to eliminate a terrorist cell that was planning chemical weapons attacks against civilian targets. Sarah's intelligence had been accurate, her technical penetration had been flawless, and the tactical strike had been executed with precision that should have minimized collateral damage. But intelligence reports hadn't mentioned the 37 civilians who were sheltering in the building's basement, and precision strikes still produced casualties when innocent people were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah had watched the aftermath through satellite feeds, counting body bags and reading after-action reports that classified the mission as a strategic success, while acknowledging acceptable levels of civilian casualties. The mathematical precision of the language hadn't made the images any less haunting or the guilt any less consuming. She'd requested reassignment immediately, citing psychological factors that made continued field operations inadvisable. Her supervisors had been understanding, even sympathetic. Field operatives had limited operational lifespans, and Sarah had already exceeded the average duration for agents working in high-threat environments. The transition to domestic operations had been presented as a reward for exceptional service, an opportunity to use her skills in lower-risk environments while maintaining the clearance levels and operational capabilities that made her valuable to QARD's mission. The assignment to Portland had been perfect cover for monitoring domestic networks and tracking financial flows that might indicate terrorist activities within the United States. Sarah's job at Meridian Tech Solutions provided legitimate access to databases and communication networks, while keeping her far enough from Washington to avoid the kind of scrutiny that accompanied agents working in proximity to their actual employers. For 3 years, she'd lived the quiet life of Sarah Chen, database administrator and unremarkable citizen. She maintained her cover identity so thoroughly that her neighbors knew her as the woman who kept her lawn meticulously trimmed, and always brought her garbage cans promptly after collection. Her co-workers at Meridian saw her as competent but antisocial, dedicated to her work but uninterested in office politics or after-hours socializing. But maintaining deep cover required more than just behavioral consistency. It demanded psychological commitment to becoming the person whose identity you'd assumed, and Sarah had discovered that spending years pretending to be ordinary was perhaps more challenging than any of the technical or physical training she'd received. The loneliness was the hardest part. Not the physical isolation, which she'd learned to manage during her training, but the intellectual and emotional isolation that came from never being able to share the real details of her work or background with anyone around her. She'd made friends with Janet Morrison, her supervisor at Meridian, but their conversations were limited to work topics and safe subjects like television shows and weekend plans. She'd dated occasionally, but relationships were complicated by the fact that significant portions of her past were classified at levels that made casual disclosure impossible. The cat, Pixel, had been an attempt at companionship that didn't require explanations or emotional vulnerability. Pets didn't ask questions about mysterious phone calls or unexplained absences, and caring for another living creature provided psychological anchoring that helped maintain the illusion of normal domestic life. But even her apartment reflected the careful artificiality of her cover identity. The furniture was generic enough to have come from any department store, the decorations were minimal and impersonal, and the books on her shelves were selected to reinforce her supposed background in computer science and database administration. Hidden behind false panels and concealed within modified household items were the tools and equipment that connected her to her real employers and actual mission. Encrypted communication devices disguised as kitchen appliances, weapons caches hidden inside furniture, and monitoring equipment that tracked activities throughout the Pacific Northwest while appearing to be ordinary electronic devices. The defensive systems that would soon activate in the parking garage were just one component of a comprehensive security network that QARD had established around her cover identity. If Sarah's safety was compromised, automated protocols would trigger responses designed to neutralize threats while preserving her operational capability and maintaining plausible deniability for her government employers. These systems had been developed by teams of engineers who understood that valuable assets required protection that went beyond conventional security measures. The technology integrated biometric monitoring, environmental sensors, and response mechanisms that could operate independently of direct control, while following engagement rules that balanced operational necessity with legal constraints. Sarah's laptop bag contained transmitters that monitored her vital signs and location, broadcasting encrypted signals to receivers that tracked her status continuously. If her heart rate indicated distress, if her movement patterns suggested duress, or if specific trigger conditions were met, the defensive network would activate automatically. But the real sophistication lay in the response mechanisms themselves. Rather than relying on conventional weapons or obvious defensive technologies, the system utilized approaches that turned attackers' own aggression against them, while appearing to be coincidental environmental factors. Marcus Rivera had no way of knowing that the woman he'd chosen as a target was protected by systems that treated assault against her as an act of aggression against United States national security interests. His background check had consisted of following her routine for 3 weeks and confirming that she appeared to live alone without obvious connections to law enforcement or security services. Danny Walsh and Trevor Knox were even less informed about their target's actual background. To them, Sarah Chen was just another isolated office worker whose routine made her vulnerable to predation. They'd participated in similar operations dozens of times without encountering resistance that couldn't be overcome through superior numbers and willingness to use violence. The parking garage at Meridian Tech Solutions was about to become a classroom where 3 criminals would receive education about the differences between appearance and reality, between vulnerability and tactical disadvantage, and between victims and people who'd been trained to survive in environments where death was the penalty for operational failure. But the lesson wouldn't be delivered through conventional means. Instead, it would come through a demonstration of what happened when people who thought they understood violence encountered systems designed by individuals whose understanding of violence was informed by years of experience, in environments where survival required thinking several steps ahead of opponents who were trying to kill you. The first bat strike had already connected with Sarah's ribs, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking garage, electronic systems that had been waiting patiently for exactly this scenario were beginning to respond, with the kind of precision that Marcus Rivera and his crew would soon discover was far beyond their ability to comprehend or counter. The counterattack was beginning, and it would proceed with the methodical efficiency that characterized all QARD operations, thoroughly, professionally, and with outcomes that would leave no doubt about the consequences of threatening assets under the protection of people who took such threats very seriously indeed. The second blow landed across Sarah's shoulder blades with enough force to send her stumbling forward into the concrete support pillar. Danny Walsh had put his full weight behind the tire iron, and the metallic clang of impact echoed through the parking garage like a church bell announcing violence. Sarah's laptop bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the ground with a muffled thud that scattered its contents across the oil-stained concrete. "That's what happens when you move too slow," Danny said, breathing hard from the exertion and adrenaline. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his grip on the tire iron, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air circulating through the underground space. Marcus stepped closer, examining the scattered items from Sarah's bag with the calculating expression of someone inventorying potential profit. Her laptop had slid several feet away, its screen cracked but still glowing with what appeared to be routine database queries. A collection of technical manuals lay spread across the concrete, their covers showing titles about network administration and cybersecurity protocols. "Boring office stuff," Trevor observed, nudging a thick handbook about server maintenance with the toe of his boot. "But the laptop's probably worth something." Sarah remained on her knees beside the concrete pillar, one hand pressed against her ribs where Marcus's first blow had connected. Her breathing was controlled but audibly labored, and she kept her eyes focused on the ground, rather than making direct eye contact with her attackers. To the three men surrounding her, she appeared to be exactly what they'd expected: a frightened office worker overwhelmed by sudden violence and struggling to process what was happening to her. But appearances, as Sarah had learned during her years of training, were often the most effective weapons available to those who understood how to weaponize other people's assumptions. "Please," she said, her voice carrying the tremor that victims were supposed to display in situations like this. "I gave you everything: my purse, my car keys, my laptop. Why are you still hurting me?" Marcus crouched down beside her, bringing his face close enough that she could smell the cheap beer on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow where someone had probably hit him with something sharp during a previous altercation. His eyes held the cold satisfaction of someone who enjoyed having power over others, especially others who couldn't fight back effectively. "Because," he said softly, "you need to understand something important. This isn't just about your stuff. This is about respect, about understanding your place in the world." He stood up and gestured for Danny and Trevor to move closer. "See, we've been watching you for weeks. Same routine every day, same time, same route home. Walking around like you own the place, like you're better than the people who actually grew up in this neighborhood." Sarah looked up at him with confusion that appeared genuine but was actually carefully calculated. "I don't understand. I've never done anything to you. I don't even know who you are." "That's exactly the problem," Trevor said, rolling the steel pipe between his palms. "You walk through our territory every day without even acknowledging that we exist, like we're invisible, like we don't matter." Danny nodded enthusiastically, eager to participate in the ideological justification that was making their violence feel more righteous. A rich girl with her fancy job and her college education probably makes more money in a month than we see all year. The accusation was ironic enough to almost make Sarah smile, given that her actual salary from QARD was classified information, and her cover job at Meridian paid less than what these three probably earned from their various criminal enterprises. But irony was a luxury she couldn't afford, while maintaining her persona as a helpless victim, whose only hope for survival lay in their mercy. "I'm not rich," she said, allowing a note of desperation to creep into her voice. "I live in a studio apartment and drive a 15-year-old Honda. I'm just trying to make a living like everyone else." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Trying to make a living by taking jobs that should go to people from this neighborhood. College-educated outsiders coming in and pushing out locals who need the work. The conversation was moving in directions that Sarah recognized from her psychological training on criminal behavior. What had started as a simple robbery was evolving into something more personal and therefore more dangerous. Marcus and his crew were working themselves up to justify escalated violence by creating a narrative where she represented larger social and economic forces that had wronged them. This kind of ideological escalation often preceded the transition from property crime to assault with intent to cause serious harm. Sarah's training had covered scenarios like this extensively, both from the perspective of understanding criminal psychology and from the practical standpoint of survival when negotiation and compliance failed to de-escalate dangerous situations. "Look," she said, "I understand that you're angry about things that are bigger than just this situation, but I'm not your enemy. I'm just someone trying to get home safely." But even as she spoke, Sarah was conducting tactical assessments that had nothing to do with victim psychology and everything to do with professional evaluation of hostile actors and their capabilities. Marcus was approximately 6 feet tall, probably 180 pounds, with the build of someone who stayed in shape through manual labor rather than formal exercise. His grip on the baseball bat was competent but not professional. He'd used it as a weapon before, but he wasn't trained in its tactical application. His positioning suggested he was right-handed and favored overhand strikes that generated power through leverage rather than precision. Danny was smaller and quicker, but his nervous energy was making him unpredictable in ways that could be either advantageous or dangerous depending on how the situation developed. The tire iron was a crude weapon, effective for generating blunt force trauma but requiring close proximity that would make him vulnerable to counterattack if the opportunity arose. Trevor was the most physically imposing, but also the least tactically sophisticated. His reliance on size and strength suggested limited experience with opponents who might possess technical fighting skills or weapons training. The steel pipe was essentially a club, devastating if it connected but slow to deploy and easy to anticipate. More importantly, all three were positioning themselves in ways that demonstrated they'd never encountered serious resistance during previous operations. They were standing too close together, creating opportunities for a skilled opponent to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Their weapons were held casually rather than in ready positions, suggesting they didn't expect their victim to transition from compliance to aggression. But the most significant tactical advantage Sarah possessed was something her attackers couldn't see, couldn't anticipate, and wouldn't understand until it was too late to matter. The biometric sensors woven into her clothing had been transmitting data about her physiological state since the moment Marcus first approached her. Heart rate, blood pressure, stress hormones, and movement patterns were being monitored by systems that could distinguish between normal anxiety and genuine life-threatening distress. The first bat strike had triggered initial alert protocols. The second blow had elevated the threat assessment to code orange, indicating that the subject was experiencing assault that might escalate to serious bodily harm. But the systems were designed to avoid premature activation that might compromise operational security, so they continued monitoring while preparing response mechanisms that could deploy within seconds of final authorization. That authorization would come automatically if Sarah's vital signs indicated life-threatening trauma, if she failed to check in according to predetermined schedules, or if specific trigger conditions were met that suggested her cover identity had been compromised beyond recovery. But it could also be activated manually, through a sequence of movements and vocalizations that would appear natural to observers, while actually serving as coded instructions to defensive systems that were currently operating in standby mode. Sarah was about to provide those instructions, but first she needed to ensure that when the counterattack began, it would be comprehensive enough to prevent any of her attackers from escaping to spread information about what they'd witnessed. "I have money," she said, reaching slowly toward her jacket pocket. "More than what was in my purse. If that's what you really want, I can give you everything I have." Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of money?" "Emergency cash. I keep it hidden in case something like this happens." She pulled out a roll of bills that contained exactly the amount a careful office worker might reasonably keep for emergencies. $300 in 20s and 50s, enough to seem significant without appearing suspicious. Danny's eyes widened as he saw the money. "Holy shit, Marcus, that's more than we usually get from 3 or 4 jobs." But Marcus was studying Sarah's face with the kind of attention that suggested he was beginning to suspect that something about this situation wasn't matching his expectations. "You just happen to carry emergency cash worth more than most people make in a week." Quote, "My grandmother always told me to be prepared," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact while simultaneously calculating the exact sequence of movements that would activate the defensive protocols. "She lived through the Depression. She taught me that you never know when you might need money that isn't connected to banks or credit cards." The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy Danny and Trevor, but Marcus continued studying her with growing suspicion. He'd conducted enough robberies to develop instincts about when victims were hiding something, and something about Sarah's demeanor was triggering alarms in his criminal intuition. "Stand up," he said suddenly, slowly. Sarah complied, using the concrete pillar for support while deliberately favoring her left side where the bat had connected with her ribs. The movement brought her into position for the activation sequence while appearing to be simple compliance with his instructions. "Turn around. Face the wall." This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The position Marcus was demanding would place her back toward her attackers, while giving her the visual privacy necessary to complete the coded gesture that would transition the defensive systems from monitoring to active engagement. As she turned toward the concrete wall, Sarah allowed her right hand to trace a specific pattern against the pillar's surface. 3 horizontal lines followed by 2 vertical marks, executed with the precise timing that the recognition software had been programmed to identify. 2 miles away, in a monitoring facility that officially didn't exist, automated systems registered the activation code and immediately began executing protocols that had been designed by people who understood that sometimes the best way to protect valuable assets was to ensure that threats against those assets were eliminated with extreme prejudice. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, stepping closer to Sarah's turned back. "I think there's more to you than meets the eye. I think maybe you're not just some random office worker who got unlucky tonight." He was right, of course, but his understanding of how right he was wouldn't become clear until the counterattack began in earnest. The parking garage was about to become a demonstration of what happened when street criminals with conventional weapons encountered defensive systems that had been developed with budgets that exceeded the GDP of small nations and deployed by people who took threats against their assets very personally indeed. Marcus raised his bat, preparing to deliver a blow that would force additional information from someone he was beginning to suspect might be worth more than just the contents of her purse. But the aluminum baseball bat would never complete its downward arc, because the counterattack was finally beginning, and it would proceed with the kind of methodical efficiency that characterized all operations conducted by people who understood that half measures were often worse than no measures at all. The first indication that something had changed came not from Sarah, but from the parking garage itself. Marcus was mid-swing with his baseball bat when the overhead fluorescent lights began flickering in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, like electronic music played through illumination. The effect was subtle enough that Danny and Trevor didn't immediately notice, but Marcus paused with his weapon halfway through its arc, his criminal instincts warning him that environments weren't supposed to change during simple robberies. "What the hell?" Danny muttered, glancing up at the ceiling where the lights continued their strange pulsing sequence. "Electrical problem?" But the lights weren't malfunctioning. They were responding to signals transmitted by systems that had just transitioned from passive monitoring to active engagement, and the illumination changes were the first visible indication that Sarah Chen was no longer the helpless victim her attackers had assumed her to be. Sarah remained facing the concrete wall, her right hand still pressed against the pillar where she'd completed the activation sequence. To Marcus, Danny, and Trevor, she appeared to be cowering in anticipation of the next blow. They had no way of knowing that she was actually counting down from 10, giving the defensive systems time to establish target locks and prepare engagement protocols that would demonstrate why threatening government assets was considered an extremely poor decision by people who made such policies. The second change was auditory. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the immediate lighting, a sound began that was barely perceptible at first. A low humming that might have been mistaken for distant machinery or ventilation systems. But the frequency was wrong for anything that belonged in a parking garage, and it was growing steadily louder with each passing second. Trevor was the first to vocalize what all 3 attackers were beginning to feel. "This place is giving me the creeps. Let's take her money and get out of here." But Marcus had invested too much time and effort in this operation to be deterred by flickering lights and mysterious sounds. "Relax. Old buildings make weird noises all the time. We're finishing this conversation first." He completed his swing, and the aluminum bat connected with Sarah's left shoulder with a sharp crack that echoed through the concrete space. But instead of the cry of pain he expected, Sarah's response was something that made Marcus's blood temperature drop several degrees. She laughed. Not the hysterical laughter of someone breaking under stress, but the quiet, confident amusement of someone who just realized that her opponents had finally committed themselves to actions that would justify responses they were completely unprepared to handle. "You shouldn't have done that," Sarah said, still facing the wall but speaking with a tone that carried none of the fear or desperation she displayed moments earlier. "The system registers that as assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. That changes everything." Marcus stepped backward, his bat still raised but his confidence beginning to erode as he processed the implications of what he'd just heard. "What system? What are you talking about?" Sarah turned around slowly, and when Danny, Trevor, and Marcus saw her face, they realized that something fundamental had changed about their victim. Her expression was calm, professional, and carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing that the tactical situation had just shifted decisively in her favor. "Biometric monitoring, threat assessment, and automated response protocols," she said conversationally, as if she were explaining database administration procedures to new employees at Meridian Tech Solutions. "Every impact you've inflicted has been recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to systems that take threats against classified personnel very seriously." Quote. The humming sound was growing louder, and now it was accompanied by other noises that didn't belong in parking garages. Electronic whirring, mechanical clicking, and what sounded like small motors activating in sequence throughout the underground space. Danny's grip on his tire iron tightened as he looked around nervously. "Marcus, I don't like this. Something's wrong here." But Marcus was still processing Sarah's words, trying to understand how a simple robbery had evolved into something involving classified personnel and automated response systems. "You're lying. You're just some office worker trying to scare us." "Office worker, yes," Sarah replied, "but just is where you made your mistake. Sarah Chen, database administrator at Meridian Tech Solutions, is a cover identity. My actual employer takes a much more serious view of people who threaten their assets." As if summoned by her words, the first drone emerged from the shadows near the garage entrance. It was approximately the size of a dinner plate, matte black, and moved with the silent precision of military hardware designed for specific tactical applications. Its approach was unhurried, but purposeful, and the small red light pulsing beneath its chassis suggested that it was actively scanning and recording everything within its operational range. Trevor pointed at the approaching device with his steel pipe, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "What the hell is that thing?" "Target identification and threat assessment," Sarah explained helpfully. "It's cataloging your faces, analyzing your weapons, and calculating optimal engagement strategies based on current tactical parameters." A second drone appeared from the opposite direction, followed by a third that descended from somewhere in the ceiling structure. Within 30 seconds, Marcus and his crew found themselves at the center of a triangle formed by autonomous systems that were clearly designed for purposes that went far beyond civilian security applications. "This isn't possible," Marcus said, but his voice carried less conviction than he intended. "Shit like this doesn't happen during regular robberies." "Regular robberies don't typically target intelligence operatives under federal protection," Sarah replied. "You picked the wrong victim, Marcus Rivera. You too, Danny Walsh and Trevor Knox." The use of their full names hit the three attackers like physical blows. They'd been careful not to use names during the robbery, and Sarah had given no indication that she knew who they were. But somehow, the woman they'd thought was a helpless stranger had identified them with the kind of precision that suggested access to databases that civilian contractors weren't supposed to be able to reach. "How do you know our names?" Danny demanded, his nervous energy escalating toward panic as the implications of their situation became clearer. "Facial recognition, voice pattern analysis, and cross-reference with criminal databases," Sarah said. "The drones scanned you the moment you approached me. Marcus Rivera, age 26. 3 prior arrests for assault and robbery. Danny Walsh, 19. Juvenile records sealed but accessible to certain agencies. Trevor Knox, 28. Outstanding warrant for aggravated assault in Multnomah County." She paused, allowing them to process the fact that their anonymity had been completely compromised by systems they didn't understand and couldn't counter. "Your locations of residence, known associates, criminal histories, and current legal status are already being transmitted to relevant authorities. But that's assuming you survive the next few minutes, which depends entirely on your next actions." The threat was delivered with the same conversational tone she might have used to discuss weather patterns, but the effect on Marcus, Danny, and Trevor was immediate and dramatic. The confident aggression that had sustained them through the early phases of the robbery evaporated, as they realized they were no longer dealing with a victim who could be intimidated through superior numbers and weapons. Marcus raised his bat again, but his movement was defensive rather than aggressive. "You're bluffing. There's no way some database administrator has access to military drones and classified systems." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "A database administrator wouldn't have access to these resources. But someone with clearance levels above your security threshold would. Someone whose cover identity was carefully constructed to provide operational camouflage while maintaining access to defensive capabilities that activate automatically when certain conditions are met." As if responding to her explanation, the drones began moving in coordinated patterns that demonstrated sophisticated programming and tactical awareness. They maintained constant triangulation around the three attackers, while adjusting their positions to account for potential escape routes and weapon ranges. The humming sound was now clearly coming from the drones themselves, but it was being joined by other mechanical noises that suggested additional systems were activating throughout the parking garage. Emergency lighting began illuminating areas that had been dark, revealing that the underground space was larger and more complex than it had initially appeared. "What do you want?" Trevor asked. His steel pipe now held more like a security blanket than a weapon. "We'll give you back your stuff and leave. No harm done." Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that suggested Trevor's offer was insufficient to resolve their current situation. "The harm has already been done. You've assaulted a federal asset, compromised classified operations, and demonstrated intent to cause serious bodily injury to someone under government protection." She gestured toward the drones, which had begun emitting additional scanning beams that painted red dots across the attackers' torsos and faces. "These systems aren't designed for de-escalation. They're programmed to neutralize threats against high-value assets using whatever level of force is necessary to ensure mission success. Your options at this point are extremely limited." Danny was the first to break. The combination of being identified by name, surrounded by autonomous weapon systems, and confronted with the realization that their victim was something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated, pushed him past his psychological breaking point. "I didn't sign up for this," he shouted, dropping his tire iron and raising his hands. "This was supposed to be a simple robbery. I don't want to fight the goddamn government." But Marcus wasn't ready to surrender. His criminal career had been built on the principle that superior aggression could overcome most obstacles, and he couldn't accept that 3 experienced street criminals were being outmaneuvered by 1 woman and some flying machines. "Bullshit," he snarled, tightening his grip on the baseball bat. "I don't care what kind of spy movie nonsense you're trying to pull. You're still just 1 person, and we're still 3 guys with weapons." That's when the first dart struck him in the neck. The projectile was fired from the drone positioned behind his left shoulder, and it delivered its payload with the precision that came from targeting systems designed to incapacitate specific individuals without affecting nearby personnel. Marcus had time to register a brief sting, like an insect bite, before the fast-acting sedative began circulating through his bloodstream. "What did you do to me?" he demanded. But his words were already beginning to slur, as the chemical compound interfered with his nervous system's ability to maintain normal motor function. "Non-lethal incapacitation," Sarah explained clinically. "The compound will render you unconscious within 60 seconds while causing no permanent physiological damage. It's designed for situations where targets need to be neutralized, without creating diplomatic complications." Marcus tried to swing his bat at the nearest drone, but his coordination was deteriorating rapidly. The aluminum weapon whistled through empty air as the autonomous system effortlessly evaded his increasingly unsteady attack. Trevor and Danny watched in horror as their leader stumbled against the concrete pillar, his legs no longer able to support his weight effectively. The confident criminal who'd planned and executed their assault was being systematically disabled by technology they'd never encountered and didn't understand. "We surrender!" Trevor shouted, dropping his steel pipe and raising both hands above his head. "Whatever you want. We'll cooperate." But Sarah's expression suggested that surrender might no longer be a viable option for resolving their situation. "The problem with surrender," she said thoughtfully, "is that it requires trust. You've demonstrated that you're willing to use violence against people you perceive as vulnerable. The systems protecting me are programmed to err on the side of caution when it comes to future threat assessment." A second dart struck Trevor in the shoulder, and he immediately felt the same numbness beginning to spread through his nervous system that had already incapacitated Marcus. Danny, realizing that compliance wasn't going to save him from whatever was happening, turned and ran toward the garage entrance with the desperate speed of someone who'd finally understood that he was completely out of his depth. He made it approximately 30 feet before the third drone intercepted him with a dart that dropped him face first onto the concrete with enough force to leave a small pool of blood where his nose connected with the unforgiving surface. Sarah walked over to where Marcus was sitting, slumped against the concrete pillar, his consciousness fading but his eyes still focused enough to register her approach. She crouched down beside him, bringing her face close to his ear. "The next time you're thinking about robbing someone," she said quietly, "you might want to do more thorough background research first. Some people's quiet exteriors conceal capabilities that are better left undisturbed." Marcus tried to respond, but the sedative had progressed to the point where speech was no longer possible. He could only watch as Sarah stood up and began gathering her scattered belongings while speaking into a communication device that had appeared from somewhere in her jacket. "Control, this is Sierra 7. Package secured, 3 hostiles neutralized with non-lethal force. Requesting cleanup and extraction team for threat removal and evidence sanitization." The voice that responded through her earpiece was professional, emotionless, and clearly accustomed to handling situations that required discretion and thoroughness. "Copy Sierra 7, cleanup team en route, ETA 12 minutes. Are you requiring medical attention?" Sarah tested her left shoulder where the bat had connected, wincing slightly at the movement. "Negative on medicine, minor contusions only. Cover identity remains intact." "Understood. Maintain position and await extraction team arrival." As consciousness finally faded completely for Marcus Rivera, the last thing he saw was Sarah Chen calmly reorganizing her laptop bag, while 3 military-grade drones maintained overwatch positions throughout the parking garage. The robbery was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. 3 weeks after the incident in the parking garage, Janet Morrison sat in her office at Meridian Tech Solutions, reviewing personnel files and trying to understand why her most reliable database administrator had requested an immediate transfer to the company's Denver facility. Sarah Chen's work performance had been exemplary. Her technical skills were exactly what the Portland office needed, and her sudden desire to relocate seemed completely out of character for someone who'd established such a stable routine. "Did something happen that I should know about?" Janet asked during their final performance review meeting. "Your work has been outstanding. Your attendance is perfect, and frankly, I was planning to recommend you for a promotion to senior systems analyst." Sarah sat across from Janet's desk with the same quiet professionalism she'd displayed every day for the past 14 months, but there was something different in her demeanor that Janet couldn't quite identify. A subtle confidence that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along but was now more visible. "Nothing specific," Sarah replied carefully. "I just feel like it's time for a change of environment. Denver has some interesting projects that align with my long-term career goals." The explanation was perfectly reasonable, but Janet had been managing technical personnel long enough to recognize when someone was providing acceptable answers rather than complete truth. Something had changed for Sarah Chen, and that change was significant enough to motivate her to abandon a job situation that most IT professionals would consider ideal. What Janet didn't know was that Sarah's transfer request had nothing to do with career advancement and everything to do with operational security protocols that required deep cover agents to relocate whenever their civilian identities were compromised beyond acceptable risk thresholds. The Marcus Rivera incident had been contained successfully. All 3 attackers had been processed through a legal system that was designed to handle cases involving classified personnel and national security concerns. Marcus himself was currently serving 18 months in a federal facility where his contact with other inmates was limited, and his access to communication with the outside world was carefully monitored. Danny Walsh had been transferred to a juvenile rehabilitation program that specialized in redirecting criminal behavior through intensive psychological counseling and job training. His sealed records would remain sealed, but his future prospects had been significantly improved by intervention programs that most young offenders never had the opportunity to access. Trevor Knox was participating in a work release program that allowed him to maintain employment while serving his sentence through community service projects that utilized his construction skills for infrastructure improvements in underserved neighborhoods. The legal proceedings had been handled with the kind of efficiency that characterized cases where federal agencies had strong interest in ensuring that certain details remained classified. The three defendants had been represented by competent counsel, their rights had been protected throughout the process, and their sentences reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and the mitigating factors that suggested rehabilitation was possible. But more importantly, none of them retained any memory of the specific circumstances that had led to their capture. The technology that had incapacitated them in the parking garage included compounds that interfered with memory formation during the period immediately preceding unconsciousness. Marcus, Danny, and Trevor remembered attempting to rob a woman in the Meridian parking garage, but their recollections of what happened next were vague and inconsistent. They recalled being arrested by federal agents who'd apparently been conducting surveillance in the area as part of an unrelated investigation. They remembered being told that their victim was connected to sensitive government contracts that made assault against her a federal crime. But the specific details of drones, sedative darts, and automated defense systems had been effectively erased from their conscious memory. The official report described their capture as the result of routine security patrols that had been increased in response to recent criminal activity in the industrial district. 3 suspects had been apprehended while attempting to commit robbery against a civilian contractor with government security clearance. Federal jurisdiction applied because of the victim's employment status and the suspects' use of weapons during the commission of their crimes. It was a perfectly plausible narrative that explained all the essential facts while omitting details that would raise uncomfortable questions about defensive capabilities that weren't supposed to exist in civilian environments. Sarah's role in the report was limited to that of a cooperative victim who'd provided complete testimony about the assault and had requested that her personal information be protected due to the sensitive nature of her work responsibilities. Her employer, Meridian Tech Solutions, had been praised for their security protocols in cooperation with federal investigators. But operational security required more than just successful case resolution. The incident had demonstrated that Sarah's cover identity was vulnerable to the kind of random criminal activity that could expose classified operations to public scrutiny. Her face had been recorded by security cameras during the investigation, her name had appeared in federal court documents, and her connection to government work had been acknowledged in official proceedings. None of these factors individually compromised her operational effectiveness, but their combination created risk factors that exceeded acceptable thresholds for maintaining deep cover assignments in the Portland area. The transfer to Denver would provide Sarah with a new identity, a new cover job, and a new operational environment where she could continue her work without the complications that had emerged from the parking garage incident. The woman who'd been Sarah Chen, database administrator, would effectively disappear, replaced by someone with different credentials, different background documentation, and different appearance modifications that would prevent recognition by anyone who'd encountered her previous identity. But before that transition could be completed, there were lessons to be extracted from what had happened, both for Sarah personally and for the organizations that employed people like her. The after-action review had been conducted by analysts who specialized in evaluating incidents involving deep cover operatives and civilian populations. Their findings had been comprehensive, professional, and ultimately classified at levels that ensured the information would never appear in any public documentation. From a tactical perspective, the defensive systems had performed exactly as designed. Threat detection had been accurate, response protocols had been appropriate to the level of danger encountered, and neutralization had been achieved without causing permanent harm to the attackers or compromising the operative's cover identity beyond acceptable limits. But the incident had also revealed vulnerabilities in the selection criteria used for deep cover assignments and the psychological support systems provided to operatives who spent extended periods maintaining civilian identities. Sarah's willingness to endure physical assault rather than immediately activate defensive protocols had demonstrated dedication to maintaining cover that exceeded operational requirements. Her psychological profile suggested that years of deep cover work had created emotional investment in her civilian identity that might interfere with optimal tactical decision-making during crisis situations. The recommendation was for enhanced psychological evaluation and support for operatives in similar assignments, along with revised protocols that prioritized operative safety over cover maintenance when conflicts between the two became unavoidable. On her final day at Meridian Tech Solutions, Sarah completed her work assignments with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her entire tenure with the company. She transferred her active projects to colleagues who would maintain the databases and systems she'd been managing, and she provided documentation that would allow seamless continuation of her responsibilities. Her co-workers organized a small farewell gathering in the break room, complete with cake and the kind of awkward speeches that marked transitions in office environments everywhere. Sarah accepted their well wishes graciously, exchanged contact information that would become inactive within 24 hours, and promised to stay in touch with people she would never see again. Janet Morrison walked her to the elevator on her final afternoon, carrying the kind of reference letter that would smooth Sarah's transition to her new position. "You know," Janet said as they waited for the elevator to arrive, "I still feel like there's something you're not telling me about why you're leaving." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth, perhaps the first completely authentic emotion she displayed during her entire employment at Meridian. Sometimes people have reasons for their decisions that are more complicated than they can explain, even to people they respect and appreciate. Will you be doing similar work in Denver? Similar in some ways, different in others, but definitely challenging in ways that will help me grow professionally. The elevator arrived, and Sarah stepped inside with her box of personal belongings. The succulent plant, a few technical books, and a coffee mug that had been a gift from her secret Santa during the previous year's holiday party. "Take care of yourself," Janet said as the doors began to close, "and remember that you always have friends here if you need anything." Quote. The doors closed before Sarah could respond, but Janet thought she saw something in her expression that might have been sadness or relief, or perhaps both emotions simultaneously. 3 hours later, Sarah Chin officially ceased to exist as an employee of Meridian Tech Solutions. Her access badges were deactivated, her computer accounts were closed, and her personnel file was transferred to archived status, where it would remain as evidence of a competent employee who'd relocated for career advancement opportunities. But in a facility that didn't appear on any organizational charts, analysts were already preparing the documentation and identity materials that would allow someone with Sarah's skills and experience to begin a new assignment under a different name, in a different city, with a different cover story that would provide operational camouflage for activities that served national security interests. The woman who'd been Sarah Chen had completed her mission in Portland successfully. The threats against her had been neutralized, the criminal organization that had targeted her had been dismantled, and her cover identity had been exfiltrated before compromising details could spread to other hostile actors. But more importantly, she demonstrated something that would influence operational protocols for years to come, that quiet competence often concealed capabilities that were more significant than dramatic displays of power, that underestimation was a tactical advantage that could be leveraged effectively, and that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who appeared to be the most vulnerable. The lessons learned from the parking garage incident would be incorporated into training programs for future operatives, strategic planning for cover identity development, and tactical doctrine for defensive systems deployment in civilian environments. Marcus Rivera, Danny Walsh, and Trevor Knox would spend their sentences wondering why a simple robbery had attracted federal attention and resulted in consequences that seemed disproportionate to their crimes. They would never understand that they'd attempted to victimize someone whose protection was considered a matter of national security importance. But their cases would serve as examples for other criminals who might consider targeting people based on assumptions about vulnerability and isolation. Sometimes the quiet ones had stories that were more significant than anyone around them realized. And sometimes those stories mattered more than the loud ones that demanded attention and recognition. The real lesson wasn't about defensive technology or intelligence operations or federal law enforcement capabilities. It was about the danger of making assumptions about people based on appearance, the value of treating others with respect regardless of their apparent status, and the understanding that everyone carried histories and capabilities that weren't immediately visible. Sarah Chen had been a database administrator who processed routine reports and maintained computer systems with professional competence. She'd also been something else entirely. Someone whose quiet exterior concealed experiences and skills that most people couldn't imagine. The intersection of those two realities had created a situation where criminal violence had encountered consequences that its perpetrators were completely unprepared to handle. As Sarah's replacement began work at Meridian Tech Solutions the following week, the cycles of ordinary life resumed their normal patterns. But something fundamental had changed in that environment. An understanding that competence and capability weren't always obvious, that respect should be offered rather than earned through demonstration, and that assumptions about other people's stories could be dangerously incomplete. The quiet ones, it turned out, sometimes had the most important stories of all. 6 months after Sarah Chen disappeared from Portland, a different woman walked into the offices of Rocky Mountain Data Systems in downtown Denver, carrying credentials that identified her as Dr. Patricia Nakamura, a cybersecurity specialist with advanced degrees from MIT and Stanford. Her employment history showed a progression through prestigious technology companies, her security clearance documentation was flawless, and her technical interview demonstrated expertise that impressed even the senior engineers who'd been skeptical about hiring someone with such an impressive resume. Patricia Nakamura appeared to be everything that Dr. Elizabeth Harper had been when she'd first approached a brilliant graduate student at Stanford 7 years earlier. Confident, accomplished, and carrying the subtle markers of someone whose professional capabilities exceeded what most civilian environments could fully utilize. But appearances, as everyone involved in this story had learned, could be both revealing and deceiving simultaneously. The woman who now carried Patricia Nakamura's identity had retained all of Sarah Chen's memories, experiences, and psychological development, but she'd also undergone modifications that went beyond simple documentation changes. Facial reconstruction that altered bone structure in ways that couldn't be detected through casual observation. Voice coaching that shifted accent patterns and speech rhythms, enough to defeat audio recognition systems. Posture and movement training that changed the way she carried herself through space. But the most significant changes were psychological. The parking garage incident had marked a transition point for someone who'd spent years maintaining perfect cover at the expense of authentic human connection. The experience of being genuinely threatened, of having her carefully constructed civilian identity put at risk by random violence, had forced her to confront questions about purpose, identity, and the costs of living multiple lives simultaneously. Dr. Patricia Nakamura was designed to be Sarah Chen's evolution, someone who could maintain operational effectiveness while developing the kind of genuine relationships that made deep cover assignments psychologically sustainable over extended periods. Her new employer, Rocky Mountain Data Systems, was a legitimate technology company that provided cybersecurity consulting for clients throughout the American West. But like Meridian Tech Solutions, it also served as operational cover for activities that weren't reflected in any public documentation. Patricia's official responsibilities included network security assessment and penetration testing for corporate clients who needed to evaluate their digital vulnerabilities. Her actual mission involved monitoring communications networks for indicators of terrorist financing, weapons trafficking, and other activities that threatened national security interests in the region. The work was similar to what she'd done in Portland, but the operational environment had been carefully designed to avoid the isolation and routine that had made Sarah Chen vulnerable to the kind of random targeting that had nearly compromised her mission. Rocky Mountain Data Systems encouraged social interaction among employees, organized regular team-building activities, and maintained a workplace culture that made it natural for Patricia to develop friendships and collegial relationships that provided both emotional support and additional layers of cover for her classified activities. Her immediate supervisor was Dr. Michael Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, a former NSA analyst who understood the challenges of maintaining civilian cover while conducting intelligence operations. Their working relationship was designed to provide professional mentorship while ensuring that Patricia's psychological well-being remained stable throughout what could potentially be a multi-year assignment. "How are you adjusting to the altitude?" Dr. Chen asked during her first week on the job, gesturing toward the mountains that dominated Denver's western horizon. "Some people find the transition from sea level challenging." "I'm adapting well," Patricia replied, appreciating the coded nature of his question. Altitude adjustments served as metaphor for the broader challenges of transitioning between identities and operational environments. "The view is certainly different from what I'm used to, but I think the change of perspective will be beneficial." "Good to hear. And if you find yourself needing additional support for any aspect of the adjustment process, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to ensure that our team members have everything they need to be successful here." The conversation was entirely professional and appropriate for any new employee orientation, but it also served as confirmation that Patricia's psychological support systems were in place and available if the stresses of maintaining deep cover began affecting her operational effectiveness. But perhaps the most significant change in Patricia's situation was the presence of other employees who were also operating undercover identities for various federal agencies. Unlike the complete isolation she'd experienced at Meridian, Rocky Mountain Data Systems functioned as a community of intelligence professionals who could provide mutual support while maintaining their separate operational missions. Humez Rodriguez worked in the accounting department while actually tracking financial networks used by drug cartels operating along the Colorado-Mexico corridor. Lisa Park managed client relations while monitoring communications between domestic extremist groups and their international supporters. David Thompson ran technical support while developing penetration tools for accessing encrypted communications used by hostile intelligence services. None of them discussed their actual work with each other, but their shared understanding of the psychological demands of deep cover operations created an environment where emotional support could be provided without compromising operational security. For the first time since her recruitment 7 years earlier, Patricia found herself part of a community where she didn't have to maintain perfect isolation to protect her mission effectiveness. 3 months into her assignment in Denver, Patricia was conducting a routine network penetration test for a regional banking client when she discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist. Hidden within the bank's transaction processing systems was a sophisticated money laundering operation that was moving millions of dollars through accounts that appeared to belong to legitimate small businesses throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The financial flows were too complex and too well concealed to be the work of ordinary criminals. The digital signatures suggested involvement by people with advanced technical training and access to tools that weren't available through conventional sources. Most significantly, the timing patterns of the transactions corresponded to known operational schedules for terrorist organizations that were currently active in Central Asia. Patricia's discovery represented exactly the kind of intelligence breakthrough that justified the resources invested in deep cover operations. But it also created the kind of situation where her actions would determine whether months of careful investigation could be converted into actionable intelligence that might prevent future attacks against civilian targets. The challenge was gathering sufficient evidence to support legal action while maintaining her cover identity and avoiding actions that might alert the targets to ongoing surveillance. Patricia would need to balance the immediate opportunity against the long-term value of her position, weighing short-term intelligence gains against the broader strategic advantages of maintaining her operational capability for future missions. Her decision-making process was informed by lessons learned from the Portland incident. The importance of recognizing when cover maintenance needed to be balanced against operational necessities. The value of seeking support from supervisors who understood the complexities of deep cover work. And the understanding that sometimes the most effective approach was patience rather than immediate action. Patricia documented her findings through encrypted channels and requested guidance from handlers who could evaluate the intelligence in context of broader counterterrorism operations. Her report was comprehensive, professional, and demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical capability that made deep cover operatives valuable for intelligence gathering in civilian environments. The response came within 24 hours. Continue surveillance and documentation, but avoid any actions that might compromise your position or alert targets to ongoing investigation. Additional resources were being deployed to support expanded investigation of the financial network, but Patricia's role was to maintain her position and provide ongoing intelligence about the system she'd discovered. The decision represented a validation of the lessons learned from her previous assignment. Rather than risking valuable assets for immediate gains, the operation would proceed with patience and methodical development of intelligence that could support comprehensive action against the entire network rather than just its visible components. But more importantly, Patricia's integration into the Rocky Mountain Data Systems community provided her with colleagues who could share the psychological burden of conducting long-term surveillance operations while maintaining civilian cover identities. Complicated client project? Dr. Chen asked when he noticed Patricia working late several evenings in succession. More complex than initially apparent, she replied carefully. The kind of situation where thorough analysis is more important than quick results. Those are often the most valuable assignments in the long run. Take care of yourself while you're working through it. Marathon, not sprint. The conversation provided both professional guidance and personal support without requiring any discussion of classified details. Patricia appreciated having supervisors who understood the demands of her actual work while maintaining the boundaries necessary for operational security. Over the following months, Patricia's surveillance of the money laundering network provided intelligence that led to operations in 14 countries, the arrest of 43 individuals involved in terrorist financing, and the disruption of planned attacks against civilian targets in Europe and North America. But the success of the intelligence operation was measured not just in immediate tactical results, but in the demonstration that deep cover operatives could maintain long-term effectiveness while developing the kind of human connections that made their assignments psychologically sustainable. Patricia had learned to balance professional isolation with authentic relationships, operational security with emotional well-being, and mission effectiveness with personal growth in ways that Sarah Chen had never been able to achieve. The transformation represented more than just improved operational protocols. It demonstrated that organizations could protect their most valuable assets by creating environments where those assets could develop resilience, adaptability, and effectiveness that exceeded what could be achieved through technical training alone. But the lessons learned from Patricia's evolution extended beyond intelligence operations and federal agencies. The principles that had made her transition successful were applicable to anyone who found themselves underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because their capabilities weren't immediately visible to people around them. The parking garage incident had begun with 3 criminals who made assumptions about someone's vulnerability based on appearance, routine, and apparent isolation. Their mistake hadn't been tactical or strategic. It had been fundamental. They'd failed to recognize that quiet competence often concealed capabilities that were more significant than dramatic displays of power. But the same mistake was being made every day in offices, schools, communities, and organizations where people's contributions were evaluated based on visibility rather than substance, where respect was awarded based on volume rather than value, and where assumptions about others' stories created blind spots that prevented recognition of hidden strengths and capabilities. The woman who'd been Sarah Chen had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by people who saw only what she wanted them to see. But her real strength hadn't come from defensive systems or government protection. It had come from the understanding that effectiveness didn't require recognition, that competence didn't need external validation, and that the most important work was often done by people who never received credit for their contributions. That understanding was available to anyone who'd ever been ignored in meetings, where their ideas were later adopted by louder colleagues. Anyone who'd been passed over for recognition because their contributions weren't dramatic enough to attract attention. Anyone who'd been dismissed as unremarkable while quietly doing the work that kept systems functioning and organizations operating. The defensive technology that had protected Sarah Chen was unique to her specific circumstances, but the principles that had made her effective were universal. Competence over appearance, substance over presentation, patience over immediate gratification, and the understanding that real strength came from internal confidence, rather than external recognition. These principles applied whether someone was conducting classified intelligence operations or managing database systems, whether they were protecting national security interests or simply trying to do good work in environments where their contributions weren't fully appreciated. The story of what happened in that Portland parking garage wasn't ultimately about government agencies or defensive systems or criminal justice. It was about the danger of making assumptions about people based on incomplete information, the value of treating others with respect regardless of their apparent status, and the understanding that everyone carried capabilities and experiences that weren't immediately visible. Marcus Rivera, Danny Walsh, and Trevor Knox had learned these lessons through consequences that were more severe than most people would ever face. But the same lessons were available to anyone willing to consider that their assumptions about others might be incomplete, that quiet people often had the most interesting stories, and that respect should be offered rather than earned through demonstration. The transformation from Sarah Chen to Patricia Nakamura represented personal growth, professional development, and psychological healing that had been made possible by organizations that understood the value of supporting their people rather than simply exploiting their capabilities. But it also represented something that was available to anyone who found themselves underestimated or overlooked. The understanding that other people's failure to recognize your value didn't diminish that value, that quiet competence was often more effective than dramatic displays, and that the most important recognition came from internal understanding of your own capabilities rather than external validation from people who might not be qualified to evaluate your contributions. The parking garage incident had ended with 3 criminals learning that their assumptions about vulnerability and strength had been completely wrong, but it had begun something more significant, a journey toward understanding that effectiveness, respect, and recognition were internal qualities that couldn't be taken away by other people's failure to appreciate them. Whether someone was conducting classified operations under deep cover or simply trying to do good work in environments where their contributions weren't fully appreciated, the same principles applied. Competence didn't require validation. Strength didn't need to be displayed. And the most important stories were often carried by the people who seemed to have the least to say. The woman who'd been Sarah Chen had discovered that truth through violence and federal protection. But the same truth was available to anyone willing to recognize that their quiet colleagues, unassuming neighbors, and unremarkable acquaintances might be carrying capabilities, experiences, and stories that were more significant than anything that demanded attention through volume or drama. Sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who didn't need to tell you how dangerous they were. Sometimes the most capable people were the ones who didn't need recognition to validate their competence. And sometimes the most important stories belonged to people who never asked for attention because they understood that real strength came from internal confidence rather than external recognition. The choice was always available: to make assumptions based on appearance, or to offer respect based on humanity, to dismiss people based on their failure to demand attention, or to appreciate them based on their contributions, to overlook the quiet ones, or to recognize that they might have the most important stories of all. What happened in that Portland parking garage changed everything for the people who experienced it directly. But the lessons learned from that experience were available to anyone willing to consider that their assumptions about others might be incomplete, that respect should be offered rather than earned, and that the most significant capabilities were often carried by people who appeared to have the least to prove. The story continues every day, in every interaction where people choose between assumption and respect, between dismissal and appreciation, between overlooking the quiet ones and recognizing that they might have stories worth hearing. The question isn't whether you've ever encountered someone whose quiet exterior concealed remarkable capabilities. The question is whether you recognized them when you did. 2 years after the Denver assignment began, Dr. Patricia Nakamura received a message that would fundamentally change her understanding of everything that had happened since that night in the Portland parking garage. The communication arrived through encrypted channels during what appeared to be a routine intelligence briefing. But the sender identification made her heart rate accelerate in ways that hadn't occurred since Marcus Rivera had first approached her with his baseball bat. The message was from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the woman who'd recruited her at Stanford 7 years earlier, and who Patricia had assumed was simply another government handler managing deep cover operations for QARD. But the content of the communication revealed that Elizabeth Harper was something far more significant than a recruitment coordinator, and that Patricia's entire career had been shaped by forces she'd never suspected. Patricia, the message began, using her current identity but speaking with a familiarity that transcended operational protocols. It's time you understood the real scope of what you've been part of. The parking garage incident wasn't random. Your attackers weren't chosen by chance. And your rescue wasn't simply the result of defensive systems protecting a valuable asset. The revelation that followed would force Patricia to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her recruitment, her training, her assignments, and the true nature of the organization that employed her. Dr. Elizabeth Harper wasn't just a government recruiter. She was the director of something called the Phoenix Project, a classified program that identified individuals with exceptional capabilities and created scenarios designed to test, develop, and ultimately transform them into assets capable of operations that exceeded conventional intelligence work. The parking garage incident had been engineered from the beginning. Marcus Rivera, Danny Walsh, and Trevor Knox weren't random criminals who'd happened to target the wrong victim. They were carefully selected individuals whose psychological profiles made them perfect for a controlled scenario designed to force Patricia's evolution from isolated operative to someone capable of balancing cover maintenance with authentic human connection. The 3 men had been under surveillance for months before they'd ever encountered Sarah Chen. Their criminal activities, their target selection methods, and their operational patterns had been analyzed by behavioral specialists who understood exactly how to manipulate their decision-making processes without directly controlling their actions. Marcus's crew had been subtly guided toward targeting Sarah through a series of environmental modifications that made her appear more vulnerable than other potential victims in the area. Adjusted lighting in the parking garage that created better concealment for attackers. Modified security patrol schedules that eliminated potential witnesses. Even the arrangement of vehicles that provided optimal positioning for the kind of ambush that Marcus preferred. But most significantly, Sarah's own behavior had been influenced through psychological conditioning that she'd never recognized as such. Her isolation at Meridian Tech Solutions, her rigid routine, her apparent lack of security awareness, all of these factors had been gradually developed through subtle environmental pressures and social dynamics that encouraged her to present herself as an ideal target for the kind of criminals the Phoenix Project needed for their scenario. The defensive systems that had rescued her were real, but they'd been activated not by automated threat assessment protocols, but by human controllers who'd been monitoring the situation from the beginning and waiting for the optimal moment to demonstrate to Patricia that her isolation and emotional detachment were tactical vulnerabilities rather than operational strengths. The purpose, Dr. Harper's message continued, was never to put you in actual danger. Every aspect of the encounter was controlled, monitored, and designed to produce specific psychological and professional development outcomes. Marcus and his associates were never going to cause you serious harm because we would have intervened before that became possible. But you needed to experience genuine threat, authentic fear, and real consequences in order to understand that your approach to deep cover operations was unsustainable. You were burning out psychologically, becoming increasingly isolated, and developing patterns that would have led to mission failure or personal breakdown within another 18 months. The revelation was staggering enough to make Patricia question everything she thought she understood about her own identity, her professional development, and the nature of the work she'd been doing. But Dr. Harper's message contained additional information that was even more significant. The transformation you've undergone since the Denver assignment, the psychological growth, the improved operational effectiveness, the ability to maintain authentic relationships while conducting classified work, these changes represent the successful completion of your development as a Phoenix Project asset. You are now qualified for assignments that exceed anything you've previously undertaken. Operations that require not just technical expertise and cover identity maintenance, but the kind of psychological resilience and adaptive capability that can only be developed through controlled exposure to genuine crisis scenarios. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Patricia, you are not the only Phoenix Project asset currently operational. The program has been developing individuals like you for over a decade, creating a cadre of intelligence operatives whose capabilities exceed conventional training methods. Your colleagues at Rocky Mountain Data Systems, James Rodriguez, Lisa Park, David Thompson, they've all been through similar development scenarios, though their specific experiences were customized to their individual psychological profiles and operational requirements. The community that had provided Patricia with emotional support and professional camaraderie throughout her Denver assignment had actually been a carefully constructed environment where multiple Phoenix Project assets could complete their development while providing mutual support for processes they didn't fully understand. Dr. Harper's message included detailed psychological profiles that explained how each team member's background had been leveraged to create scenarios that forced their evolution from conventional intelligence operatives to assets capable of operations that required unprecedented levels of adaptability, resilience, and effectiveness. James Rodriguez had been a former military intelligence analyst whose isolation and rigid adherence to protocol had been limiting his operational potential. His Phoenix Project scenario had involved a simulated betrayal by trusted colleagues that forced him to develop independent decision-making capabilities while maintaining emotional stability under extreme stress. Lisa Park had been a brilliant linguist whose perfectionism and fear of failure had been preventing her from taking the calculated risks that complex operations required. Her scenario had involved a diplomatic crisis where her inability to provide perfect translations would have led to international incidents, forcing her to develop confidence in her judgment and willingness to act decisively with incomplete information. David Thompson had been a technical genius whose social awkwardness had been limiting his ability to develop the human intelligence networks that sophisticated cyber operations required. His scenario had involved romantic manipulation by a foreign intelligence operative, forcing him to develop emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills while maintaining operational security. Each Phoenix Project asset had been guided through experiences that addressed their specific psychological vulnerabilities while developing capabilities that exceeded what conventional training could produce. The program represented an evolution in intelligence work that recognized the limitations of technical training alone and the necessity of psychological development for operatives who would be conducting increasingly complex missions in environments where traditional approaches were insufficient. But Dr. Harper's message contained one final revelation that would change Patricia's understanding of her future role in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Phoenix Project assets are being prepared for a mission that will require capabilities that no conventional intelligence organization has ever possessed. Within the next 6 months, you and your colleagues will be deployed for an operation that could prevent a catastrophic attack against civilian populations in multiple countries. The threat involves coordination between terrorist organizations, hostile intelligence services, and criminal networks that have developed capabilities exceeding anything we've previously encountered. Stopping them will require operatives who can function effectively in environments where traditional intelligence protocols are insufficient, and where success depends on adaptive capabilities that can only be developed through the kind of experiences you've undergone. The message concluded with instructions for Patricia to prepare for transition to her final operational assignment, a deep cover mission that would utilize all of her technical expertise, psychological resilience, and interpersonal capabilities in a scenario where failure would result in consequences measured in thousands of civilian casualties. But more importantly, the message included acknowledgement of what Patricia had accomplished through her development as a Phoenix Project asset. You began this journey as a brilliant but isolated individual whose capabilities were limited by psychological barriers that prevented optimal operational effectiveness. You are completing it as someone whose technical expertise is enhanced by emotional intelligence, whose professional competence is supported by authentic human connections, and whose operational potential exceeds anything that conventional training methods could have produced. The woman who was attacked in that Portland parking garage was someone whose quiet exterior concealed remarkable capabilities, but she was also someone whose isolation and emotional detachment were limiting her ability to utilize those capabilities effectively. The person you have become represents the successful integration of technical expertise with psychological resilience, professional competence with authentic humanity, and individual capability with collaborative effectiveness. As Patricia finished reading Dr. Harper's message, she realized that everything she'd experienced since that night in the parking garage had been part of a transformation that was more comprehensive and more significant than she'd ever imagined. The defensive systems that had rescued her from Marcus Rivera's crew were real, but they represented only the beginning of a development process that had fundamentally changed who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The lesson wasn't just that quiet people often had hidden capabilities. It was that those capabilities could be developed, enhanced, and directed toward purposes that exceeded what anyone might imagine based on surface appearances. Marcus, Danny, and Trevor had learned that their assumptions about vulnerability and strength were dangerous, but Patricia had learned something more profound: that her own assumptions about the limitations of her capabilities and the necessity of isolation for operational effectiveness were equally dangerous. The Phoenix Project had demonstrated that individuals could be guided through experiences that revealed capabilities they didn't know they possessed, developed strengths they hadn't known were possible, and achieved levels of effectiveness that exceeded their previous understanding of their own potential. But the program also represented something that was available to anyone willing to recognize that their current capabilities weren't the limit of what they could accomplish, that their psychological barriers weren't permanent obstacles, and that their potential for growth and development was greater than their current circumstances might suggest. The story that had begun with 3 criminals making assumptions about a quiet woman in a parking garage had evolved into a demonstration that anyone's understanding of their own capabilities might be incomplete, that growth and development were possible at any stage of life, and that the most significant transformations often occurred through experiences that initially appeared to be obstacles or setbacks. Patricia's evolution from Sarah Chen represented more than professional development or psychological growth. It demonstrated that people could become more than they'd ever imagined possible, that capabilities could be developed rather than simply discovered, and that the most important limitations were often self-imposed rather than externally determined. The parking garage incident had been the beginning of Patricia's transformation, but it was also the beginning of something larger, a demonstration that quiet competence could be developed into exceptional capability, that isolation could be transformed into authentic connection, and that individual potential could exceed anything that surface appearances might suggest. The real lesson wasn't about defensive systems or government protection or criminal justice consequences. It was about the possibility of transformation, the potential for growth, and the understanding that everyone carried capabilities that could be developed beyond their current understanding of what was possible. The question wasn't whether someone had ever been underestimated because their capabilities weren't immediately visible. The question was whether they understood that their current capabilities weren't the limit of what they could accomplish. that their potential for growth was greater than their current circumstances suggested, and that transformation was possible for anyone willing to recognize that their assumptions about their own limitations might be as incomplete as other people's assumptions about their capabilities. The story continued, not just in classified operations and intelligence missions, but in every situation where someone chose growth over stagnation, development over acceptance of current limitations, and transformation over resignation to existing circumstances. The Phoenix Project had demonstrated that remarkable capabilities could be developed through carefully designed experiences and psychological growth. But the same principle was available to anyone willing to recognize that their potential exceeded their current performance, that their capabilities could be enhanced through intentional development, and that transformation was possible for those who understood that their story was still being written. The woman who'd been attacked in that Portland parking garage had become someone whose capabilities exceeded anything her attackers could have imagined. But more importantly, she'd become someone whose understanding of her own potential had been fundamentally transformed through experiences that revealed possibilities she'd never considered. That transformation was available to anyone willing to consider that their quiet competence might be the foundation for exceptional capability, that their current limitations might be temporary rather than permanent, and that their story might be just beginning rather than already determined. The choice was always available to accept current circumstances as permanent limitations or to recognize them as starting points for development that could exceed anything that surface appearances might suggest was possible. The parking garage incident had ended with 3 criminals learning that their assumptions were dangerously incomplete, but it had begun something more significant, a demonstration that anyone's understanding of their own capabilities might be equally incomplete, and that the most important discoveries often involved recognizing potential that had been there all along, waiting for the right experiences to reveal it. The story wasn't ending, it was evolving, continuing in every moment when someone chose growth over limitation, development over stagnation, and transformation over acceptance of circumstances that might be temporary rather than permanent. The question wasn't whether you'd ever been underestimated, because your capabilities weren't immediately visible. The question was whether you understood that your current capabilities weren't the limit of what you could accomplish, and whether you were willing to begin the kind of development that could transform quiet competence into exceptional capability. Your story, like Patricia's, was still being written. The only question was whether you would be the author, or simply a character accepting limitations that might be more temporary than you'd ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.